So in the previous part we have understood the generation of nerve impulse, how the nerve impulse is generated on the nerve fiber. Now in this part we are going to understand the conduction or propagation of nervous impulse or nerve impulse. Now we said that the nerve fiber is electropositive on the outer side, or the membrane of the nerve fiber is electropositive on the outer side and it is electronegative on the inner side. Now here, if the stimulus is given to the nerve fiber, if the stimulus is given to the nerve fiber, at that time we said that the sodium channel gates are there, they open because of the stimulus, because of the voltage of the stimulus. The sodium channel gates are there, they open, and as the channel gates they open, the sodium ions which are present outside the membrane, nervous membrane, those sodium ions they enter inside the membrane or inside the neuroplasm. Now here sodium ions are present outside. The electropositive charge which is outside the membrane is because of the sodium ions, and electronegative charge which is there inside the membrane, in the inner side of the membrane, is because of the negatively charged proteins which are present inside the neuroplasm. Now here, as we said, if the stimulus is given to the nerve fiber or the membrane, on the membrane, at that time the sodium channel gates they open, and as the gates open, these sodium ions they move inside the neuroplasm, and as these sodium ions they move inside, what happens, the charges also change. Here at the beginning, when the membrane is electropositive on the outer side and electronegative on the inner side, we say at the resting state that we saw in earlier part, at the resting state the membrane is polarized, means outer side is electropositive and inner side is electronegative. But when the sodium ions they move inside the neuroplasm, at that time the charges change. Now here the inner side becomes positive and the outer side becomes negative. Outer side of the membrane becomes negative. Here we said that the impulse was generated. The nervous impulse was generated over here. Now here we say that the depolarization takes place. At the beginning it was polarized. The outer side was positively charged and the inner side was negatively charged. But when the sodium ions move in, at that time the outer side becomes negatively charged and the inner side becomes positively charged. This is said to be depolarization of the membrane. So here it gets depolarized. Now after this, what happens, this nerve impulse which is generated over here at one point, it has to travel, it has to be conducted from one point to another point. So if this is the nervous membrane, here the first point is as it is polarized, outer side is electropositive, inner side is electronegative. Here the impulse was generated. Here what happens, this positive charge, it attracts the negative charge. The positive and the negative charges, they attract each other. Here also outer side, the negative and the positive charges, they attract each other. Now as they attract each other, what happens, this positive charge moves here and this negative charge moves this side. So here again this positive charge will come here, this negative charge will be transferred this side, and the negative charge which is here, it will be transferred at the next position, and the positive charge will be transferred at the next position. So in this way, from point 2, suppose this is point 1, point 2, 3, 4 and 5. So here from point 2 from point 2 to point 3 the charges are conducted. In the same way, from point 3 to point 4 the charges will be conducted. From point 4 to point 5, in this way the charges are conducted from one point to another point on the nervous membrane. So here again the when the charge is when these charges are transferred here, again here depolarization will take place. Here depolarization will take place, and this side will become again repolarized. This side will become repolarized. As the impulse travels from this point to this point, here again it will become repolarized, and this will become depolarized. In this way, the impulse gets transferred from one point to other point. So this happens in the case of non-myelinated sheath, or the fiber which is non-myelinated. This happens in the case of non-myelinated fiber. But in the case of myelinated fiber, suppose this is the membrane. In the case of myelinated fiber, this is the membrane. This is the myelinated sheath which is present on the membrane. This is the myelinated sheath which is present on the membrane. And the spaces where the myelinated sheath is not present, these spaces are called as the nodes of Ranvier. So here also the outer side is electropositive, the inner side is electronegative. Here also the outer side is electropositive, inner side is electronegative. In this way. Now, if these charges has to travel from one node of Ranvier to other node of Ranvier, how they will travel? Here, suppose a stimulus is given to the nerve fiber. Stimulus is given to the nerve fiber. After the stimulus is given, what will happen? This polarization will change into depolarization. This fiber, this point of the nerve fiber will become depolarized. Means the inner side will become positively charged, the outer side will become negatively charged. And here we say that the impulse was generated. Impulse has been generated. Now this impulse has to travel to another node of Ranvier. Now what happens in myelinated sheath? The impulse it does not travel from it does travel from one point to other point, but here it jumps from one point to other point. Here, as it jumps from one node of Ranvier to other node of Ranvier, what will happen over here at the second node of Ranvier? Here also the impulse will change the polarized membrane into depolarized membrane. The outer side will become electronegative, the inner side will become electropositive. As this impulse from here, it jumps to the second node of Ranvier. Here, this side or this node of Ranvier will again become repolarized. The depolarization which was generated over here at the first node of Ranvier, this depolarization jumped to the second node of Ranvier. So the first node of Ranvier will automatically become repolarized. Now this depolarization, it will jump to the third node of Ranvier. Now here, if it jumps here, this side will become electropositive. The outer side and the inner side will again change into electronegative. But here it will become electronegative and here it will become electropositive. As the impulse jumps from one node of Ranvier to the other node of Ranvier, the depolarization changes as the impulse jumps from one node of Ranvier to other node of Ranvier. So this happens in the case of myelinated sheath. So if the impulse is jumping from one node of Ranvier to another, the nerve or the nervous membrane, it will look like this. These are the myelinated sheath. Now here, in the beginning, the impulse was generated. This impulse has jumped from one node to the second node. So here, this will become electropositive again. It will become repolarized again. And the inner side will become electronegative. The impulse is generated to the second node of Ranvier. So the second node of Ranvier, the outer side will become electronegative and inner side will become electropositive. If it jumps from second node to the third node, at that time, if it jumps from second node to the third node, the third node will become electronegative from outer side and electropositive from inner side. And the second node, it will again be repolarized, that is positive from outer side and negative from inner side. So in this way, the impulse jumps from one node of Ranvier to other node of Ranvier in the case of myelinated fibers. And in the case of non-myelinated fibers, the impulse jumps from one point to other point. Now here, there are voltage channel gates of sodium, calcium, potassium present here in the non-myelinated fiber. Whereas in the myelinated fiber, there are no channel gates present over here. There are no channel gates for sodium, potassium. The impulse jumps from one node of Ranvier to other node of Ranvier. There are no channel gates. Now here, as in the non-myelinated fiber, there are channel gates. The sodium ions have to move inside the neuroplasm. So this absorbs energy. This requires energy. So ATP is consumed over here. Each time when the sodium ions, they enter inside the neuroplasm, each time the ATP is consumed. Suppose at second point, the sodium ions are entering inside the neuroplasm. At that time, the ATP will be consumed, energy will be consumed. This impulse will travel from second point to third point. Here also, the sodium ions will enter. At that time also, the ATP will be consumed or the energy will be consumed. But here, there are no channel gates needed to open, so less energy is required as compared to the non-myelinated fiber. In the myelinated fiber, less energy is consumed. So, therefore, having a myelinated sheath on the nerve fiber is advantageous because the myelinated fiber or the conduction in the myelinated fiber requires less energy or consumes less energy. Or you can say it is energy conservative conduction. The next that we will say that myelinated sheath or myelinated fibers are 20 times the conduction here happens 20 times faster than the non-myelinated fibers. So here the conduction process is 20 times faster as compared to non-myelinated fibers. The conduction in the myelinated fibers is 20 times faster as compared to the non-myelinated fibers. So here in the myelinated fibers, less energy is consumed because the impulse jumps from one node of Ranvier to other node of Ranvier. Now this type of conduction is called as this when the impulse it jumps from one node of Ranvier to other node of Ranvier. This type of this type of conduction is called as saltatory conduction. So, the conduction or propagation of nerve impulse we have seen. If the nerve impulse is generated at one point in the non-myelinated fibers, what happens? If the impulse is generated at one point, it travels or it moves from one point to another point through the attraction of negative and positive charged ions. So here the loops are very small, so it can move easily to the another point. But here the loops are larger, so the impulse has to jump from one node to another node, or the impulse has to jump from node to node in the myelinated fibers. Whereas in the non-myelinated fibers, energy is consumed, more energy is consumed because of the voltage channel gates which are present over here for the ions. Those voltage channel gates need energy to open up, and when the sodium ions they travel inside the neuroplasm, energy is consumed, where more energy is consumed. Whereas in myelinated fibers, what happens, there are no voltage channel gates present over here, so the impulse has to jump from one node to another node, so there less energy is required as compared to the non-myelinated fibers.